Hi everyone, I'm Susan Birch and welcome to another A Health Detective podcast. I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's guest, Dr Friedemann Schaub. I should have checked with you, Dr Friedemann, about pronouncing your name properly. Dr Friedemann is a medical doctor and cardiologist with a PhD in molecular biology. And I'm going to let him tell you how this led into his work about the vital connection between our mind, our body, and our ability to take care of our health. Dr. Friedemann has many resources on his website, an excellent podcast, and is the author of the book, The Fear and Anxiety Solution. And as always, I will make sure we've got links in the show notes as to where you can find him and all his resources. So I named 2022 the year of self-care. So having Dr. Friedemann as the first guest for the new year is perfect. I've got lots of questions for him about the relationship between our ability to take care of ourselves and our feelings of self-worth, and also the different beliefs and emotions that we have that get in the way of being able to look after ourselves. So Dr. Friedemann, thanks for coming today. Lovely to have you here.
Thank you. This is an exciting topic, and I love 22 as the year of self-care. I'll take it. That's something that I could definitely take on as well.
Fabulous. That's great. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself? I'm really curious how a physician and cardiologist ended up working in the field of the conscious and subconscious mind.
Well, I mean, you could say this is exactly your topic in regards to, what is really caring of ourselves. And being in cardiology, I saw a lot of people who were not taking care of themselves. And they came to the hospital with heart attacks, strokes, high blood pressure, basically, as the aftermath of years of not being able to take care of themselves. Now, I personally found that stress and anxiety were a huge risk factor for all of those cardiovascular diseases. But, in cardiology, you're not necessarily trained, or you don't have the time to help people with choices around their mental health or help people around choices around their self-care. So eventually for me, it just became like, well, we are really dealing here with the symptoms. We are kind of trying to bat away the tip of the iceberg, but we're not really going to the root cause. So we can have more and more of people coming to us in these emergency situations, but we are not really helping the greater population to not have to go through this, not have a heart attack, not have a stroke. So what can we do to really make people healthier rather than just keeping them alive? And so that's where my whole mindset around medicine just shifted from going into, basically the physical manifestation of our challenges to helping people more at the root cause, so that they stay healthy and well. But in a step in between, I went into molecular biology, and I think molecular biology was just something I find so fascinating because it explains the human body in a complete different way than allopathic medicine. In allopathic medicine, we always look for the faults. This is why the body breaks down, and this is why the doctors are needed to put it back together. And in molecular biology, it basically says, well, this is how the body works, and it's so much more miraculous and so much more adaptive and so much more capable than you ever thought. And there's so many unopened doors still there that it's just really amazing to know how we perform every day little miracles inside of each and our cells. So that opened me up then to just feeling like, we have all the resources inside. We have infinite amount of healing power. We have ability to change. We have ability to adapt. How can we use it? What is the best way to actually get to that what we have rather than looking for outside solutions? And this is where the mind plays such an important role. not the intellectual conscious mind, because that's just limited in its abilities. We can churn our thoughts forever and never really do anything about it. It's about those emotional and habitual patterns that really drive us and that really make all the difference in how we go about life. And that is the domain of the subconscious. So that's how I got into the subconscious. And since almost 20 years, I'm working on that, helping people to overcome fear, anxiety, and raise their awareness on who they really are. Ultimately, worthy, beautiful beings that have been unfortunately underestimating themselves for most of their lives.
Absolutely fascinating topic. I don't know if it's possible to briefly and simply explain how our subconscious mind can affect all the cells in our body, or whether, that would obviously be a very complex topic, but what sort of messages are we giving our cells, and how and why are our cells responding to those messages?
You could say the subconscious operates primarily through these, emotions that are going through our system. Of course, there are other ways our subconscious, I'm raising the arm. Well, this is a conscious decision, but it's more a subconscious way of regulating the flexing and the stretching of different muscles so that I could raise the arm. I'm playing piano. I don't know how I consciously can really play piano, because my fingers find the keys more or less subconsciously, because that is what they were trained to do. So there's a lot of subconscious, regulation that we are not even aware of. But what I'm talking about with the health issues, there's definitely the release of neurotransmitters that are flooding the entire system, whether it's the stress hormones or whether it's dopamine and others that are having a direct influence on how our cells and our body works. And that is not an intellectual process, that is the emotional process. And, some neuroscientists would maybe disagree, because there is a difference between brain and mind. And I feel it's much more important or much more empowering to work with the mind than with the brain, because unless you have really neurosurgical abilities to go into your brain and change something, you're pretty much powerless. So, you can change your diet and things like that. But working with the mind makes it a much more organic way of really seeing that everything we do, everything we believe, everything we feel is in itself an ability for us to make changes, or just to stay in those patterns that have been, like you said, removing us from maybe taking care of ourselves.
So we all have these different belief systems, and I think most of us, we have some belief systems or some beliefs that really support us and help us live better and more productive lives, and then we have beliefs that don't really serve us that well. Where do these come from? How do we get them? And then when we've got beliefs that aren't really serving us well, how can we challenge them and change them? And how do we even know that we have them in the first place? Because we have all this chatter going on all day long that we're often not even aware of.
The core beliefs that we have certainly stem from our childhoods. It's like you have to imagine that when we are very little, our cognitive abilities are very limited. We cannot really figure things out so easily on, how is the dynamic between the parents? What does it mean that my sibling is always bullying me? Why do the kids in school laugh when I'm standing up and blushing? As adults, you can go back and try to reason with that. But as children, you're just really dealing with the immediate emotional response. And when something like this happens enough, then your subconscious says, okay, so how do we keep you safe? Because the subconscious has one prime directive. It has two, but the first prime directive is to keep you safe and to make sure that you are, going through life fairly unharmed, protected, supported. And so there are different beliefs that can help that. So for example, if you always feel like the parents are fighting and you're afraid, subconsciously that would mean for you that you may end up without a parent, or that you may end up without that safety of home. Your subconscious may say, oh, it's your job to make sure that they are not fighting. So you become the pleaser. You become the one who takes care of the peace in the house. And I'm saying this because I was that person. I was actually even giving the name Friedemann because of that, which means man of peace, because I was from birth and even before already the designated, savior of the marriage. And so that is something that I knew, I felt, I believed since my childhood. Others would say, well, I need to hide out. My belief is the world is not safe, and I just gonna hide out and, avoid all different kinds of conflicts or judgments or rejections, because that is my belief. I am not good enough. I am not lovable. I am not safe. All of those things are deeply ingrained. Now, when we become adults, these beliefs may have been pushed aside. Let's say, for example, you have believed, I'm not good enough. I'm just really a bad person. And then you become an adult and you say like, well, there one thing I'm good seems to be school. I actually get A's. And then all of a sudden you start like focusing on being an achiever, and you put yourself out and you feel like, wow, now I get actually some positive feedback. And this is the second prime directive of the subconscious, is to make you happy, to give you good experiences. So now you have one aspect of you believing it's not safe in the world, and the other aspect saying, oh no, when you are perfect, when you are an achiever, when you have reached your goals and get all the positive feedback, then that's how you go through life. And the problem can happen that with this, the conflicting beliefs, that you also create conflicting ways of going through life as an adult. And I have seen this many times where there were people that go to work with confidence and drive and ambition because they feel like this is their source of self-worth. And then they go home and feel exactly how they felt as a child: insecure, afraid, avoiding of any social interactions, because they still believe that they're not good enough, that they're not lovable. And so there is this dynamic that comes from the childhood that they are still living without even knowing that these beliefs from the past are driving them. And so how do you know what beliefs you have? Watch your patterns, the patterns especially that bring up feelings of insecurity, that bring up feelings of anxiety, that bring up, discomfort when you have to get beyond the pattern. And also write down your chatter. Chatter is not chatter. Chatter is basically your subconscious constantly whispering in your ears, trying to tell you something. And we just bat it away and say, well, this is monkey mind, blah, blah. And it's not true. A lot of what we're hearing is repeating itself. And a lot of what we're hearing has a deeper meaning. And the meaning is often that it's repeating the beliefs. Oh, you can't do this. Oh, this is not safe. Oh, what did the neighbor think when they were looking at you with a frown? And so those, negative sentences, these phrases in our head that feel just so unnecessary, are often driven by those limiting core beliefs from the past. And so just noticing what are the thoughts that repeat themselves, what are those maybe themes, and then identifying the beliefs underneath is a starting point to eventually outgrow those beliefs, replace them with something what you rather want to believe.
So my work with people, which is around, improving their health, losing weight, and, it's I find it quite challenging because we know that there's a huge obesity epidemic, type 2 diabetes, and, there's a pandemic of health crises. But at the same time, we don't want to go out there and fat shame people and make people feel even worse about where they are at. And I think there's a couple of things there. One, how do people learn to accept themselves and their bodies? And we only have one body and we've only got one life. So how do we learn to accept that's who we are and then embrace that? And then how do we deal with the conflict between our goals and our beliefs? I see so many people come with goals. I want to lose weight. I want to run a marathon. I want to do all these things. But then as soon as a challenge pops up in their way, which I think goes back to what you were just talking about, doesn't it? About how that then can just knock us off track. So, what's the relationship between our beliefs and achieving our goals? And then how do we learn to accept our bodies for all the different shapes and sizes that we are and really focus on that self-care and self-worth rather than just what the scales say? Few questions in there.
Well, I think, acceptance of the body is not necessarily where I would start. I would start with acceptance of responsibility, because the fact is that we often abuse our body with food, that we often abuse our body by not doing anything and not using the body, not moving the body, not stretching the body. And I certainly have done my fair share of that too. The idea that our body is just, the one that needs to be guilted or blamed for looking a certain way takes not into account that we made often the body this way. Yes, maybe some are really from, their genetics prone to being overweight. But then there is a majority that also knows I haven't really been connected to my body. I have been eating beyond what my body needed. I have been rather taking acids than listening that my body actually doesn't like the food I'm stuffing in. I have been, giving my body sugar, even though I know this is not what my body really needs or wants. And so there is the mind that needs to take responsibility in a way of being the steward of the body, saying, hey, I have this body and this is my vehicle and this is what gets me through life. So I want to take care of the body. And when you do then take responsibility, then your body becomes more an object of affection that you want to support and, nourish back and take care of, rather than that what you fight with, your weight, how it looks, because it's a relationship of animosity, a relationship of, conflict. And that's not healthy on a just physiological level. And that's not really getting you anywhere, because once you are at this perfect weight, then what? Then you go back into your old patterns. Your mind is still not changed. Your relationship, your body hasn't improved, because it's a conditional relationship. It's like, okay, now you look the way I want you to look. But that doesn't mean that, you feel like proud or, like, I'm always thinking my body would be like a horse. And if I have horses. And so if I carry, if my mind and my soul gets carried through life in my body, how would I take care of my horse? Well, I definitely watch out for what it eats, and I, train it and I brush it. And we have just to change our relationship there. And then we have to ask ourselves, what are the beliefs that got us to abuse our body? The belief, for example, that we are, rewarding ourselves through food, which can be a belief from our childhood. Food, spaghetti meatballs means love. Or that the belief, no one wants to hear really what I have to say, so I just gonna eat some ice cream and some cookies to stuff my emotions in and make my life a little bit sweeter. Or I had clients that have been struggling with weight, and then deep inside they had that belief that, hey, if I'm going to lose weight, I'm going to get unwanted attention. And all of a sudden, men look at me in ways I don't want them to look at. So I need to protect myself. I need to have this extra weight. All of those things are secondary benefits of abusing the body. And unless we are addressing those patterns, I think it's just always a temporary fix. We are strong holding ourselves by deprivation and, really hard efforts into fixing our body issue. And then we realize, well, this is not sustainable. This hasn't really changed me as a person. It's just like, again, training for a marathon, but you don't run a marathon every day. And once you have the marathon done, you feel like, oh, checked it off. And you may just go back to how you were before, because it's not really an identification. You didn't change your identity. You only changed preliminary your behavior or how you look, but not necessarily how you are relating to yourself. And I think that's the important part.
I call that trying to hate yourself skinny, abusing yourself skinny.
It's true. Yeah.
And then until you have that feeling of self-worth, that you are worth doing this for the long term, it's just exactly what you said. You just go back to where you were. I was talking to a client yesterday, and she'd done very well and then had regressed, and life had got in the way. And we were talking about, how going back to her old style of eating, how did that solve the problems that she was facing. And in the end, she said, Susan, I think it's just an excuse. I want an excuse to eat this stuff. So how do we
That's great. I love that. Good for her.
Yeah. And I just wondered, how do we deal with that? How do we acknowledge that and deal with that?
Yeah, I think it's a need, I mean, I don't blame anyone who uses food to, pleasure themselves or to have some kind of a comfort or, again, reward. But I think we have alternatives, and we have to look for those alternatives, because just like beliefs come from our childhood, those patterns often come from our childhood too. So, how would you want to reward yourself other than getting a cheesecake? And how do you want to, soothe yourself when you're sad, other than, having to just go back to whatever, the sugar or eating too much? And so there are ways that we have to learn that are actually more rewarding. And a lot of people that do struggle with food also isolate themselves from others. So is it a way to just create a barrier between you and your loved ones? And what if just working on opening up, being more vulnerable, showing more what you really feel? What if that would feel more nourishing than food, more comforting, having a hug or a really nice conversation, than just sitting by yourself and ultimately having a mixture of, there is the high of, oh, this feels so good because I'm eating, and then there is a low of feeling ashamed and guilty afterwards. It's not really gratifying to do this. And so we just have to be a little bit more creative, just how we have to change how we talk to ourselves in order to change our beliefs. We also have to change how we are meeting our needs in order to not abuse our body.
I'll get on to talking about, maybe some strategies people can use to do that in a minute. But I wanted to just briefly talk about this connection with food. So many of my clients, I would say, probably close to 100% of my clients all tell me that they're foodies, that they have this love of cooking and this love of food. And they love preparing food for their families as well. And I guess that goes back to what you were just talking about there a little bit.
I mean, love and food are very connected, and I find this especially in, Italian and Southern European cultures, that this is just something where you connect. You sit together, you eat, you talk, you drink wine, and 3 hours later, you just feel so much better about the world. And that's a wonderful thing, absolutely. But you also have to see that this is not necessarily what makes you abuse food or makes you, overweight. It's like, how do you handle it? Do you handle it by, once you cook food, that you have to eat 3 or 4 portions rather than 1? Are there certain foods that you're cooking that actually are maybe from your past? That's what mom always did, but it's totally unhealthy and it's certainly not good for your cholesterol. So can you also change your menu and still have this sense of, this is how I show love? And are there ways to show love in not in the kitchen ways? I mean, are there ways you can find connection that don't involve necessarily food? It's this identification with, this is who I am, which keeps us stuck, where people say, well, I'm a foodie, or I'm an achiever, or I'm just a goal-getter, or I'm a type A. And when we identify ourselves, we are ignoring the 90% that we are also able to be. Like Einstein said, we are only using 10% of our potential. Well, that is one of the reasons why, because we are so comfortable in telling ourselves this is who we are. I struggle with this often with clients that see themselves as anxious. I am anxious. I am dealing with anxiety. I was diagnosed with anxiety disorder, and that becomes their identity. And shifting out of this identity is a big step towards real change. Because as long as you think this is who you are, you will go back to the same patterns, thinking and acting and feeling, and then nothing really eventually going to change. You're just going to go back to what you think you are.
Well, let's talk a little bit about anxiety and fear, because I know this is an area that's of particular interest to you. You've written a book about it, you have podcasts about it, and you have some amazing resources to help people work through it. So do you want to talk a little bit about that and what kind of strategies people can use to help get themselves started on that process?
Yeah. I mean, I love anxiety because I had it for many years. So I know intimately that anxiety exists and how it feels, and that it can definitely feel like your guardian, like you feel held hostage by your own emotions. So yeah, it's a struggle when you are approaching it as such. But why I love anxiety is because it became my greatest teacher. And I think also the catalyst for me to realize, well, my greater purpose is to help people to overcome those emotional struggles. And without my anxiety, I probably would never have been on this path to do that. And I see this all the time, that anxiety is misunderstood as a burden, or misunderstood as a weakness, or something we have to be afraid of. And very often anxiety is something that comes from our, unresolved issues of the past, such as emotions, such as traumatic experiences, or inner struggles that we just haven't been able to resolve. And B, it's also the anxiety that is a misunderstanding of ourselves. I, for example, had so much anxiety about not feeling good enough. And so into my 30s, I was always trying to prove myself that I'm worthy, that I'm smart, that I'm capable. And, henceforth I had, all these accomplishments. And I realized even after all those accomplishments, I was still anxious. So that didn't really solve the problem. What I didn't have was an acceptance of myself. So until I finally found a way to accept and eventually, it may sound corny, but love myself, I had anxiety, as if the anxiety was nudging me and pushing me until I came to that point. So I think the anxiety can be an opportunity to really discover yourself more, to tune into more your greater purpose, to understand more what you're about. You just have to go through the layers and through the messages and be brave to not just, kill the messenger, but really go into, what does actually anxiety try to tell me? Maybe the anxiety is not wrong when it tells me it's not okay just to go for external validation. You need to look for internal validation and ultimately need to be at peace with yourself. I couldn't just be peaceman for others. I had to learn to be peaceman for myself. And so that is something that I'm so grateful for the anxiety, because it was so relentless with obsessive compulsive behaviors and everything until I found that peace inside of myself. So it's like pain, it's like when your clients come to you with pain, that's usually what gets them to go on this journey to look for greater health. Without pain, people would just ignore their, diabetes or their inflammations because they didn't even, aware of. They live around it. So anxiety is a similar emotional or mind pain, has a similar mind pain function. It just alerts us to something that's not in balance. And if we see anxiety as such, with curiosity and an openness and wondering, what does it try to tell me? Then we can actually use the anxiety almost like as a, as again, a navigator, a compass that leads us usually to a beautiful growth. We just cannot be afraid of our own emotions. And that is a tricky part with, with anxiety, that we sometimes just want to avoid it at all costs rather than actually sitting with it and wondering what it means. And that's where having someone that helps can be quite useful. It's often a little bit more tricky to navigate through the maze of your own mind on your own. So it's good to have a little tour guide there.
Mm-hmm. Excuse me. Do you have any sort of basic tips for people? I think you work online with people, don't you? So if people,
Yes.
really wanted to work with you, they could. And again, we'll make sure we put all that in the show notes. And I know you've got those tremendous resources on your website. But, just as a couple of takeaways for now, for people listening to this who are acknowledging that they have anxiety, and that self-love is hard because, like you say, it's a cliche and we're all talking about self-love, but it's not really the kind of self-love where you stand in front of the mirror and you go, oh, I'm beautiful. And, you're 50 kgs overweight and the mind chat is going, no, you're not, don't be stupid. It's a different kind of self-love, isn't it? It's that deep connection with your own worth. But yeah, do you just have any takeaways that people could, start with?
Well, I think, the first one is, as I said, the curiosity and the being open to really decipher anxiety rather than want to avoid it. The second one is to go and really understand what we just talked about with your thoughts. What are the beliefs underneath the anxiety? When you're looking at your negative thoughts and the patterns, is it a pattern when you're anxious that you avoid everyone, you don't want to be around people? Or is it a pattern that you feel like, you have to please everyone? Or is it a pattern that you become micromanaging and hypervigilant? And when you see what anxiety makes you do, you can draw back also to the past where it comes from. And then you have a starting point. And once you look back in the past and you can visualize or imagine, wow, this is when I was the first time anxious, moments where maybe you got yelled at, or you got locked into the basement because someone was mad at you, or you got made feel responsible for parents fighting. It's all your fault. And you took it on. And when you're seeing this anxiety part of your mind as such a little child that just really got programmed to be anxious, the voice inside of your head, it's almost like takes a different pitch. You really feel like, wow, okay, I can hear now a child talking inside of me. And this child talking inside of me doesn't say, this is how it is. Oh, you're going to fail. The sky going to fall. Something bad's going to happen. It's asking you like a child would, am I okay? Will something bad happen? Is it okay to do this? Should I hide out? And then you can turn the negative self-talk into questions that a part of you is asking, and you as the adult can compassionately answer those questions. No, it's okay. We are fine. There's nothing going to bad happen. I can, absolutely do this. I don't know, a presentation at work because I'm well prepared. But the difference is you're not just using a debating club in your head. You're coming from a compassionate place, because for the first time in your life, you're going to approach the anxiety as, I want to take care of you, rather than I want to get rid of you. And when you do this, when people do this regularly for a few weeks, they notice usually that 70 to 80% of their self-talk, their negative self-talk, disappears. And when you have less negative self-talk, you have less anxiety, you already feel so much more calm and peaceful. And since you're using this positive self-talk, this countering or this answering of these anxious questions from a positive place, you automatically feel more positive about yourself. So while you're reducing the anxiety, you're building your self-esteem, and that goes hand in hand. And that's a very simple but very, very effective tool. You just have to really do it. Not every negative self-talk needs to be turned into a question and then answered, but 3 to 4 a day is enough usually to make a big difference. And that's, in all those years I'm doing this is what people experience, especially when they are committed. You have to really, this is what anxiety requires you to do. You have to be committed to yourself. You asked about self-worth before, and in order to feel self-worth, you have to go through the bridge of self-commitment. And that is really what a lot of people don't necessarily do. They want to feel self-worth, but they don't want to commit. Those things that create new habits. That's what I would suggest to start with.
I really loved that. And that just, as you were talking, I could feel like a stronger connection inside myself. You can go and look at those challenges you're facing with some love and some compassion, instead of, like we talked about earlier, trying to hate yourself to be skinny. Well, you're trying to hate yourself to get rid of the things that you're anxious about and that you worry about.
Yeah.
So just hearing you talk about that, it was really lifting and made me feel a lot better in that moment. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, this is the power, really. I just feel there is so much hate and divisiveness in the world right now that we do need to really find love and peace with ourselves. And compassion is just such a wonderful way to start fostering this, peace and love for ourselves. And ultimately, when we do have more of that peace and love for ourselves, we can also spread it then around us. And, when you thought about or started the conversation about self-care, I think that is one of the, the key messages that I think we always have to remind ourselves of. Make sure that you do not see self-care as selfish, but really see self-care as essential, and essential because it really fills you up with so much more vitality and also positivity and ultimately, with love and well-being, that you're going to be a transmitter of all of those wonderful feelings around you. But if you are constantly fighting yourself and unhappy with yourself and finding yourself is not good enough, of course, that is what you are spreading to the world. And that's just where I feel right now, unfortunately, especially with so many people struggling with, not feeling good enough based on their comparison of social media and all of these other things. That is a huge wave of discontentment that we have to counteract, because it pulls us apart. Just talked to a client today who said she spends 5 hours on social media. It's 5 hours a day, and she feels always horrible afterwards. And she is the most amazing being, but she doesn't really see it, because all she does is looking what other people are doing and how they look and what they are presenting. And in the end, you naturally feel not only disconnected from yourself, you feel that you hate yourself because everyone seems to be so much better. And that is a disease of our culture that creates a lot of this, feeling of, self-rejection that leads to unhealthy behavior. And so that is something we all can do better, just to refrain of poisoning ourselves with this comparison and living in a virtual reality that really is not real and has nothing to do with our reality as it is right now in the three-dimensional world. I mean, we are talking obviously not in the real reality because we're not across each other, but there is just something about that, habitual behavior that we have to also stop in order to gain self-worth.
Couple more things popped into my mind, so I'll ask them. They're a bit disconnected, but just so that I remember. So going back to what you were talking about earlier about finding that connection with yourself and really going deep and thinking about it, is it better to write this stuff down? Should we be writing it down, or is it okay to try and hold all those conversations in your head? And then my next question is going to be about the difference between being selfish and self-care. And that's a huge problem that I see, and that people think that they're being selfish when they take care of themselves. So 2 questions there for you.
Well, writing, yes, because it really engages more senses. And the more senses we engage, the more it becomes a part of our reality, and the more it becomes a part of it, the more we can own it. It's what happens in our head is just a very, very small aspect of us as beings. So when you write it, you use your hands. Especially when you write it with a pen, and you move, and then you see what you're writing, and then you hear how the pen is writing it. Everything is engaging you more, and the more your neural network is engaged, the more it becomes something that you realize, okay, now I can do something about it. Now it's, really literally in the palm of my hands. I can see it in front of me. Now don't only write the negative stuff down. Now you're going to write the positive answers down as well. And you see them, and you feel them, and you can hear them, and you can speak them out loud. And all of this has a much bigger impact than if you only do it in your head. So yes, do take the time to write things down, because it really engages more of you, and it's therefore much faster in making a difference. So that would be one of your questions. And the other one, remind me quickly. I lost it.
The other one was about, sorry, I'm throwing too many at you at once.
Oh yeah, selfish and self-care. Exactly. Yeah. Yes. Well, I think it's just unfortunate that this is how many people got raised, that doing something for yourself is not okay. I mean, I remember my mom, God bless her, when I had a nap when I was a teenager, and when you're a teenager, you do a lot because you're growing and your hormones are raging. And sometimes I just was so exhausted, I need to take a nap. Well, my mom every time came into the room and said, "Why are you taking a nap? Are you on drugs? Do you have a brain tumor?" And so it wasn't okay to take care of myself. She questioned me. And so at some point, I just stopped taking a nap because I didn't want to always be questioned. And I think there's just this idea of only if you have everything done, only if you have, the homework done, or if you have your chores done, then you have a right to maybe rest, relax, take care of yourself. And so self-care goes always to the bottom of our to-do list. And it's the opposite. We should have it on the top, because, even with our cars, we are dealing better than with our bodies. How can we give anything when we have nothing to give? An empty cup isn't really of any use unless you fill it up again. There's nothing coming from it. So we have to change self-care as a necessity, as an essential, as something that we owe to ourselves, and we owe it to the world in order to be the best versions of ourselves. And if we make self-care a luxury, we are just seeing it, in a very wrong way, because it leads us to be depleted. It leads us to then have to do emergency mini vacations or emergency sessions because we feel like, well, okay, now I'm close to to a nervous breakdown, or I'm having, abused my body. So self-care is actually something that we need to do also because we want to be better for those we love around us. So every time you take care of yourself, know it will ripple out to everyone else, but it will give you certainly a better experience of life. I mean, what is life for? Is life for us just to suffer and sweat and produce, or is life for the experience? If you read a book about people that, 100 years old, and there's this great book, I forgot its name, but, you read what these, wise elders tell you about what they want to give the younger people as advice about life and what life is about. They don't say anything about you should work harder or you should worry more. They say, live your life with no regrets. Because the worst you can do is to have, when you're 80 or 90, regrets of not having traveled enough, or regrets of not staying healthy enough, or regrets of not having spent enough time with your friends. Those are the things that then you realize, wow, my priorities were just totally off kilter. And I think self-care is a part of the regret that you don't want to have when you're 80.
Again, wonderful words. I just want to go back to this being selfish thing a little bit. And I want to talk about what we're teaching our children as well, because a lot of the people I work with are parents, and so they have these responsibilities to their family, to their children, to get them off to sports and to do all these things. And then they just really feel like they've run out of time to do stuff for themselves. So, what are we teaching our kids? I mean, is that a question we should be asking ourselves? What are we teaching our kids about always making them the priority and the most important? And I know, I mean, I'm a mum, I got 4 kids and, 6 grandkids, and, so you love them and you want the best for them, but are we setting them up for ongoing issues like we all have from our childhoods?
I think we do. I think there is, this modeling that is such an important learning tool for children. I mean, you can definitely learn from the parents' mistakes. So if you see your parents never taking time for themselves, you as a child can say, I don't want to be like my parents, so I'm just going to do it the opposite. But it can also be that you feel like, well, my parents never did it, so I wasn't allowed to do it either, so I'm just going to follow in their footsteps. I mean, in the end, the way we live is not anything that just goes unnoticed by our children. So we have to be, really aware of every choice we're making, the way we're talking to ourselves, the way we're treating ourselves. Like my mom, for example, was someone who never really could take a compliment, and she always put herself down, and that had an impact, so I was given the impression and actually told in so many words that feeling good about yourself is not okay because it's arrogant, and no one likes arrogance, so you're just gonna not feel good about yourself. And so that is the same thing about self-care. Self-care is not something you do unless it's Sunday afternoon between 3 and 5 o'clock. All the rest of the time you're working. So there is just, that part that I think we have to change, maybe as role models for children. But I also think the message of, life in general, so many parents are afraid of their children not being able to measure up. Everyone has in their mind, oh my God, the pressure is higher, the stakes are higher, especially in the US, where it's all about getting into a good school. It is insane how much young children are already pushed to do so many extracurricular activities and so many things that they later on can put on their resume so that they can get into a good school. And it's all about the future performance. And there is no room just to explore or just to hang out or be bored. There's every minute somehow managed and accounted for. And that is something I feel like creates an anxiety and a discontentment in children, especially, young teenagers that I'm working with. They tell me they don't want to live because they don't want to live like their parents. They don't want to live in this pressure. They're really afraid of getting older. And so there is already this feeling of exhaustion before they even start being adult. And that is something also that I think we really have to change. We have to give children more space and freedom just to be and not always have to perform. In the past, it was like these crazy parents that made their children, tennis stars or golf players. But now it's really like, the average family that thinks, oh, in order for my child to become a doctor or a lawyer, we have to start already when they're 6 years old. It's really too much. And I think a child's mind cannot handle that high pressure and that much expectation. It's going to crack.
Great comments there and great advice. I think, there's a strong temptation to do that. And again, social media becomes a real, quite powerful motivator as well for, keeping on bolstering how well your children are doing, and everybody's comparing. And, I guess if you're not out there with your kids somehow on social media, you think you're not parenting properly or your children are missing out in some way. I think that can be a trap as well.
And I know it comes from love. I know it comes from, a sense of I want the best from my child, but it is sometimes, the head basically, overruling the heart, where you just, you feel with your heart your child is suffering, but your head tells you, yes, but we have just to push harder or do more or, try to train it to be okay with that stress, because that's what life is about. And I think we all, whether it's about children, whether it's about ourselves, whether it's about our neighbors and loved ones, we have to listen a little bit more or a lot more to our hearts. Our hearts are, not so influenced by all this stuff that our heads is absorbing and trying to compute or understand. Our hearts often, it's funny, I had just this conversation with a client right before, our interview, that he told me, my wife is the one who always reads books about child raising, and she is like the most read person when it comes to, what's right for my child. And I, he said, am going more from my gut and my heart. And it's really something where it turns out that she wants to follow a certain protocol, a certain process. And then he has to swoop in and say, but don't you feel this is not the right thing for the child? And often he's right. Often she agrees later on, yeah, you were right. I just only saw what I had to do, but I didn't really saw what was a right thing from, my child's needs to do. So I think it's good to have a balance and a combination like they have in that couple. But as an individual, we just have to really make head and heart equally important and not just rely so heavily on our heads.
That brings me to another question. How do we find the balance between, with ourselves and also teaching our children, between, stepping up and taking on challenges and doing things that are hard, for the long-term process, as opposed to, I think could be a temptation to go, too far either direction. Everything is always about pushing, or everything is about feeling. How do we find that nice balance for our children where they can stand up and be resilient and do things that are challenging and hard and fail and, learn to develop this growth mindset that, we're all talking about?
I think that's absolutely right. It is a balance for sure. But I think, what we have to really instill is the belief in themselves. When you are thinking about why would a child be willing to do something that's hard or uncomfortable or get them out of the comfort zone, If you're doing it because you want to prove something to yourself or you want to push the child beyond that, it's like throwing a child into the pool and saying, well, I know you can swim. And then the child gets traumatized by that. But if you are helping the child, just nudging it at its own pace to believe more and trust more and gain more of that, this feeling, oh, I can do this, this wonderful surprise of, wow, I was able to do this. Then you're building something inside. Then it's not about an external accomplishment. It's like an internal sense of, I know that I can do more. I know I trust myself that I, can reach goals. And that's what you want to instill. That's where I think it's about the heart, where the heart says, the heart, let's say, is also the place where you do have a sense of courage and confidence in yourself. And that is based on what you experience as a child as a success. I just know a lot of people, including myself, that were pushed, didn't necessarily have that inner validation, that inner growth, that inner self-belief go hand in hand with it. It was more like getting the parent off my back or pleasing them versus gaining a greater self-esteem. Because the only positive that you got was maybe a smile or a pat on the back, but you didn't necessarily feel better about yourself. So that's where I think it's really important that as children get nudged and pushed and whatever, that they really own it and feel good about it themselves and not seeing it as, oh, dad is happy, so I'm going to just continue to make dad happy, and then I'm going to continue to make my boss happy. And it's always this need from the outside versus that satisfaction on the inside. That is really, I think, where maybe the balance can be met.
Mm. And then that comes back to exactly our own experience as adults as well, as learning to tap into that exact same feeling and emotion that we can do it because, hey, we can do it. So celebrating success, we hear a lot about how we need to celebrate success to rewire our, neural pathways. And of course, the thing that comes to mind and is always, well, let's have a drink and let's have something to eat. That way, okay, well, I deserve some chocolate. How important is it pausing and acknowledging our successes to ourselves? I know I'm absolutely terrible. I get through a day and then all I think is, oh, well, I could have done better. I need to do more tomorrow, instead of saying, hey, actually, you dealt with that quite well. Give yourself a high five or something. So how important is that and how do we do it?
I do find it incredibly important to give ourselves positive feedback ongoing. And that's why I invented an inner cheerleader who always whispers in my ear some great things about, what even the most mundane things I did, when I, work in the barn and empty a barn of horse manure. Good job. Wow, look, you did 3 wheelbarrows. That is amazing. I mean, it's just a habit now. I had to adopt the habit, but it makes you just acknowledge yourself for the things you usually overlook. Because we are all trained to only feel good when it's really amazing, when we really hit the ball out of the park. But we overlook 80% of what we do every day, the showing up, getting out of bed, even if we don't feel like it, being even, nice, even though we feel maybe anxious or stressed or angry, and all those little things that make us good beings, beings that actually mean well and have good intentions, get completely ignored by usually the people around us and by ourselves. And that makes you always feel you're in the deficit. It always makes you feel like, well, when I finally have something to celebrate, then I'm going to go big in. And that's when we get drunk or overeating. And so it's a better idea just to constantly feed yourself with a positivity. It doesn't mean that you're going to get, complacent because you feel like, well, I already did so much, I don't have to do anything else. You can still stay motivated and engaged, but you just come from a much better attitude. You don't come from this always feeling behind. You always feel like, oh, I'm owning this, I'm a part of this is my creation, whatever you want to call it. I find it very useful. For me, it has changed everything when I wasn't just seeing my to-do list as, the proof that I'm worthy, but I actually heard it all the time in my head. And I'm not 100% good at it, but when I usually have my cheerleader out, he's doing a good job. I really like it.
I love that. I love that in a cheerleader. I'm going to adopt that. And I hope everybody who's listening to this will adopt that. We're getting on for time, but I just got a couple of things I wanted to ask you. It's just such a wonderful opportunity to talk to you, and you explain this so beautifully. What about the kinds of words that we use when we are affirming someone else or affirming ourselves? I hear a lot of things thrown around like, oh, you're awesome, or you're amazing, and I stop and I think, are those really affirming words, or are those just a bit of a cop-out? Should we be saying things like, I really liked how you did that, or, you really persevered with that, and even to ourselves? Okay, you found that hard, but you stuck at it and you got it done. Is that a better way of expressing
100%.
In the chair level?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And because it really is meaningful. It reminds me when I came to the US and someone in the checkout line at the supermarket said, "How are you doing?" And I really thought she meant it. She wondered how I was doing. So I was just starting to tell her, I just came from Germany. I just moved here. And all I heard back, paper or plastic? I mean, she probably wondered, why does this guy tell me, his life story? I just said, how are you doing? Without really being interested in how you're doing. So it's the same kind of meaningless word when we say, oh, you're awesome, you're great, you're amazing. Because we know it's just something you hear 1,000 times and it doesn't really stick because it's, like background noise. It doesn't really get an association with something specific. What makes me amazing? What makes me awesome? And then your examples are perfect because this is where the mind creates little stories and connections. When we think about what we hold on to, it's usually experiences. Often we think about bad experiences when we think about anxiety or sadness, and then, there is this little movie playing in our heads. And so when we want to build good feelings about ourselves, we want to have the same movies, just the good movies where, yes, we were persevering. Yes, we were really elegantly navigating through a conflict, or yes, we were really, reaching that goal, even though it was something that we thought we couldn't, and then we are at the finish line. And so those things have so much more impact because, again, they're engaging more of your mind than if we're just using these words that, are a little hollow. This is the same thing with, I love you. It's wonderful. But sometimes it's very helpful to have an explanation why or what we are loved for, because it just means more. It means like you're not just saying the word to make me feel good. You're actually having thought about it. There is reason behind it. And, when I help people to gain their self-worth, I ask them, write down things that you have accomplished or obstacles you have overcome. And then think about what specific inner strengths and quality were necessary for you to get there. And when they do this, their whole life seems to be different because now they have stories to go back to feel good about. And they have, on black and white written down that, wow, look, this is a quality, this is a strength I have, and this is how I used it. And it's almost like they're transforming from being hollow and not good enough to actually filling the blanks to being really amazing, but really amazing with evidence beings. And I think that's really a really wonderful way to use words as, something that's creating and building self-esteem.
And the other thing I do wonder as well, when people use words like, oh, you're amazing, or, is that a way of disconnecting themselves from believing they can achieve that thing as well? Oh, you're amazing, you can just do that. Whereas if they said, oh, I'm really impressed, or I really like, you really demonstrated some perseverance there, or I could see you really overcame a challenge, then that would make them think more about, well, can I overcome this challenge? But just saying, oh, you're amazing, makes it sound like, you're a Tour de France rider and there's no way I could ever ride the Tour de France, anyway.
It definitely can happen. Yes, absolutely. I think, sometimes it's nice to give someone the spotlight without having to feed it back to yourself as, oh, what does it mean about me?
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, it can be also basically you feeling already deflated because someone is so great that you tell yourself, I can never live up to that. And then you never try. So we all should be inspirations for each other and not reasons, that make us have excuses of why we don't do it. So I think it's good to look up at each other and say, wow, what can I learn from this? Or how can I get, motivated by what this person was achieving, if it's really something that your heart wants.
Look, I know we're getting on for time. It must be 9:30 at night for you.
It is almost dinner time.
Dinner time. Would you have time to answer one more question for me? My question is about the differences between how men and women do this stuff and think about this stuff. And is there a difference? And if there is, should we be approaching this in a different way?
When you say stuff, what stuff?
The stuff, the self-care stuff, the self-worth, how we think about ourselves, all those processes. Sorry, stuff wasn't a very good word.
Such a good question. I think it's a good question that I do have to admit I'm conflicted about, because on one hand you could say, well, there is clear evidence that women are much more on, the generalization, but they're more into taking care of themselves, more into, emotional connection. They're more into, maybe also beauty than men. But is it really women, or is it our society that makes women do that? Is it something that we are just forcing onto women and denying men? So there's, all the brain and hormonal differences between the sexes. But I always believe that we are better off if we find out what we can learn from the other gender, rather than saying, well, sorry, I'm a man, you're a woman, so you do it this way, you do it that way. Because we do all have both inside of us. We do have a feminine side as men, we have a masculine side as women inside of us, and we just have to maybe really see that certain aspects that men are doing well, maybe women can really feel inspired by, and certain aspects that women are doing well, men should give themselves more permission to do. For example, it's talking about feelings, being more open to just be vulnerable, showing that, hey, I love going to get my manicure done. I mean, it's often just stereotyped as this is what women do, or, a very small, percentage of men, but the real man wouldn't do this. It's just, where our society needs to maybe just see that there are a lot of things we don't allow ourselves to explore. We don't have to like it. We can just explore it. And if we don't like it, we can just move on. But just because we are born with a certain kind of gender doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be a certain kind of way. At least that's what I feel. I think there's so much more for us to experience when we get out of the way of these. That brings me back to these identities and limitations and beliefs, and just really question them and say, well, if I want to have the full life experience, should I really have these beliefs and, ideas about myself, or should I just push them aside and say, what else is possible? What else can I find out? And what else may be interesting or pleasurable for myself?
Well, I better let you go and have your dinner. But I really want to thank you for an amazing and very uplifting conversation. And I have, you've really got me thinking, and there's so many things in there that I'm going to go away and ponder on and work on, and it will help me personally, and then also help me with my interactions with my clients. So I am so appreciative that you've taken the time to come to a little podcast in New Zealand and share this message with us all. So before we go, would you just tell us where people can find you?
Well, I want to thank you. You have really also inspired me with your questions, and they were all such in the moment, heartfelt questions. So I think these are always the best conversations and best interviews. And thank you that you got something out of it. And I hope your listeners too. And they can find more about my resources and my programs and, one-on-one coaching sessions at drfriedman.com. It's drfriedman.com, drfriedman.com. And you can also go to my YouTube channel, which is kind of my favorite social media outlet, and see a lot of my podcasts and webinars and interviews there. And hopefully yours can be also a part of that channel at some point.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much once again. And I'll let you go and have your dinner. And just once again, really appreciate you being here.